Living for God has been my one desire. God has been my everything. God's everything to me. Yeah. Living for the Spirit has set my soul free. I gave my whole life to God, then I began to see. Had a revelation. One day, my love for God was ever so true. I discovered and needs me too. Now I talking about a revelation. Had a revelation. I'm the arts of God. I'm the grace of God.
I'll tell you, we just started Passover. Usually Passover comes at the same time Easter comes, because they're tied together historically, and they're both festivals of emergence. They're both festivals of stepping out of places that appear really stuck, into places of possibility, into places of newness, into places that we haven't yet seen before. Let me see what's in this bag. I have a book. It happens that there are 49 days in Jewish tradition between leaving the enslavement of an ancient Egypt and arriving at a place called Sinai. Mount Sinai, is the paradigm of awakening. Egypt is the paradigm of enslavement. Not for Kathy Ann and members of the CSL. That was actually a long time ago. 3,316 years ago was the first Passover, in case anybody's keeping count. At any rate, some years ago, I wanted to take the 49 days and invite people into an inner process of transformation, learning about the deep wisdom of the Kabbalah, not from the outside, but from the inside. So how could we do that? By stepping into a more meditative approach. And this book it's actually the second edition of the Journey of Awakening, and it's available out there, and I wanted you to know about it. The other thing I want you to know about is that Passover is celebrated at a symbolic meal called a Seder. Seder means order. And we're having an interspiritual and an interfaith Seder that I'm leading along with another favorite of yours, Imam Jamal Rahman, and incredible woman, Ann Holmes Redding, who is the first Christian and Muslim, and who speaks eloquently as an African-American woman of how the enslavement in Egypt and the walking toward freedom served as a paradigm for the African-American community, particularly in those hard days of the civil rights movement. The problem with slavery, is that there are more people enslaved today than ever before in history. There's slave trade that's going on even in our own community. So part of looking at an ancient story and part of looking at our own story of enslavement is really to awaken ourselves to situations of pain and anguish that we need to address in our world. Just as we need to address those parts of ourselves that are stuck, that feel enslaved, that feel like we've reached walls. It's all about story. Sometimes I realize that the universe does not consist of molecules and atoms. The universe consists of stories. Each of us is a walking story. We've developed our story over the years, and we each know our story better than anybody else knows our story. Sometimes I'm convinced we so love to tell our stories that we switch relationships so that we could find somebody who's not bored already. And our stories are great. I mean, our stories really express the creation of a personality. We create ourselves. Whatever name you walk around with, you created that. For better, for worse. The blessings and the curses of our story, because in order to make any choice, we don't make other choices. The road not taken, the road taken. And there's a problem with our story, and the problem is we tend to reach a place where we start believing in our own story. And when we believe in our own story, we are in fact limited to our story. And we forget that, hey, we're the ones who invented that story. We somehow look at our parents or the people with whom we grew up and we think they invented it. But we invented it, and then we forgot that we invented it. And if we can invent this story, well, what's a bigger story we could tell? What's a story we could tell that would, oh gosh, help heal what needs to be healed in the world? And we can do that when we remember that we're the ones who created that story and reach behind our story to once again open to that creative flow of energy and invite it to create a bigger story. The essential story of Passover in many ways reflects a paradigm of moving from a place of enslavement, a place of stuckness, to a place of freedom. So essentially, it begins with degradation, with pain, and it ends with freedom. The story of our lives again and again and again and again. Why? Because every promised land magically turns into our next place of stuckness. It's like we form a relationship, and in the early days of that relationship, it is just creative and wonderful. All our time is spent thinking about, talking to, being with that other person. And then we finally formalize that relationship in one way or another, and we spend less and less time, actually, on the relationship. We kind of default into our regular lives, and we start taking things for granted, and we start taking each other for granted. And we wind up, when we wake up, to the truth that we forgot. We fell asleep in the midst of everything. So if we're to wake up, whether 3,316 years ago or today, we got to start by owning the places where we experience pain, the places where we experience grief. We celebrate Earth Day, and we know that this earth is in trouble. Sometimes I think the earth itself is crying out. And it's crying out to be heard by more and more people, and we have to add our voices and our energies to that outcry so that more and more of us can stand for that which reflects healing, conscious healing. And the same thing is true for our communities, where there's just outbreaks of unspeakable violence, unspeakable pain. So I like to start a Seder, I like to start the Passover celebration by acknowledging the anguish. And I'd like to invite you to do that with me. What does it sound like to have the earth crying out, yearning to be heard? What does it sound like if we allow ourselves to give voice to the parts of ourselves that are in pain, to the parts of ourselves that are so in need of love, to the parts of ourselves that are so in need of acceptance? What does that sound like? Maybe it starts with a moan. Like, take a breath and see what expresses. Oh, you can do so much better than that. Oh, cry for the earth, and cry for the hungry, and cry for those in poverty. And that's the beginning. In the biblical narrative, it wasn't until we cried out that anything happened. Because much of the time we get so accustomed to our stuckness and so accustomed to the place we're at and so involved in our own story, we are unconscious of the cost. We are unconscious of the consequence. So the first thing is to be able to honor the ouchness. Ouch. There's hurt here. There's that which is in need of healing. And we use an ancient story. It's a remarkable story. It's been utilized by so many different groups, particularly by the African American community that actually added to our repertoire of Passover songs. Go Down Moses, which we sing at our Seders, didn't come from Jewish tradition, it came from African American tradition. But the story is amazing. According to the story, I mean, looking back, stories kind of grow. According to the story, there were 600,000 men over 20 who left Egypt. So the rabbis had kind of factored if there were 600,000 men over 20, well, how many younger men and how many children and how many women? And they figured there was a group of between 2 and 3 million people. Can you imagine trying to herd a group of 2 million Jews? I told someone in the lobby who was asking a question about Jewish belief, and I said, wherever there are 2 Jews, there are 3 opinions. Mine, of course, is the right one, but if there were that number of people who left, I wonder about the sophistication of the sound system. Like, imagine the technology that got lost since then. I wonder about how they figured out how to travel across a wilderness, spending 40 days in a desert, leaving no trace. I mean, we need that to learn how to take care of the earth. But of course, there weren't that number of people. It was a smaller group. It always is a smaller group. But it was a very important smaller group. I'm also among those who doesn't believe that God did the plagues. It makes a wonderful story. But if God could do the plagues 3,300 years ago, and God didn't do the plagues during the Holocaust, I'm not interested in that God. I think the miracles that God does flows through us. These are the hands of God. These are the eyes of God. This is where the Word of God flows through, according to the openness of our consciousness. I actually don't believe in a God that talks. I believe in people that hear. And I think we hear according to the level of our openness and the level of our consciousness and what it's about. To move from places of enslavement to places of openness is reaching a place where we can hear more deeply. And that's what Sinai was. How do we hear? How do we hear the more universal, the more inclusive, the more loving, the more accepting? And that's the challenge of this time, and that's the challenge of all time for we human beings. And it's something particularly in this community that you support each other in doing. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's the hardest thing in the world. I mean, you look at the ancient knowing that it's all one, that that which we call the golden rule didn't come as a rule. It came as a reality. We need to start calling it the golden reality, because it came from the awakening to the reality that we are one, that we are sharing one life. There's one consciousness. The consciousness that is looking at me through your eyes and the consciousness that's looking at you through my eyes is one. It looks through the particularity of my history, of my experience, and your experience. It looks through the context of each of our stories, but there's only one life. And if I cause pain to that life, in any individual, I'm causing pain to us all. And if I support and help heal that life in any particular being, then I am supporting the healing in us all. It's the golden reality. And we still aren't doing it. Thousands of years, how come it's so hard for us to do? Like, is it possible even for us to learn this? To act it out on the world stage? Or are we doomed to collapse into such polarization that we think we can destroy the evil out there and make everything okay? It is a factor of our consciousness that we only know on this level of reality through contrast. Surely you've noticed this. If we didn't know sour, we wouldn't know sweet. If we didn't know hard, we wouldn't know soft. If we didn't know easy, we wouldn't know difficult. If everything went if everything was always wonderful, we wouldn't know it. We need the contrast on this level to know. And our real challenge is to accept both sides of the contrast. But what happens is we polarize, and we decide one side of the contrast is good and one side of the contrast is bad. And then we decide one side of the contrast is righteous and the other side of the contrast is evil. And then we're really stuck. So what's freedom? When I was a kid, perhaps you too, what I thought freedom was never having to have my parents say, no, I couldn't have something. When I grow up, I'm going to be able to get everything I want. That's freedom, huh? I could go to bed at any time I want. I could get up at whatever time I want. I don't have to. And as you all have found out, it doesn't quite work that way. So that's not freedom. That's greed. That's not freedom. That's serving the separate self. That's not freedom. That gets us even more stuck. Freedom is something different. So on Passover symbolized more than anything else by this: matzah. Matzah. Don't go to a regular supermarket in Seattle if you want to find matzah. Although PCC had it this year, and at least if a market is in a more Jewish neighborhood, it's there. Otherwise, you go and you say, where's the Passover section? And they go, the what? We moved up here from Los Angeles, and it was somewhat of a shock. At any rate, this is matzah. It's made out of wheat and water. And it's made in a very specific way to keep it flat so it doesn't rise. It's the bread of affliction, which is to say it's also the bread of poverty. Because it's just what it is. It's simple. It's, in a lot of ways, a poor person's bread. The same, every culture has one. It could be pizza, it could be pita, it could be flatbread. Every culture has some symbol of just plain the basic nourishment. But it's also called the bread of freedom because it was a symbol of what we ate when we left Egypt. Of course, the story is that we didn't have time for the bread to rise, but the truth is, that's not the truth. Because this has to be done very consciously. It has to be cooked within 18 minutes of the water hitting the wheat, or the grain. It could be spelt. And if you look at matzah, it's got a bunch of holes in it because when they put it through the oven, you want to make sure it doesn't get too bubbly. You want to keep it from rising. So it's the bread of affliction, it's the bread of poverty, and it's the bread of freedom. But at heart, it simply is what it is. When you mix flour and water and you leave it for a while, it starts rising and it becomes something different. In the mystical tradition, our ego is the puffed up quality of our being. It's the puffed up quality. We think it's so important, more important than anything else. And matzah in the mystical tradition is seen as a medicine. That for a week we eat unleavened bread to remind us of just simplicity. The fact that it's cooked before it rises means it is just simply acceptance of what it is before it changes. It's symbolic of acceptance of ourselves just as we are. That ego voice that says, well, yeah, I'll accept me. I have to lose 20 pounds. I have to gain 20 pounds. I have to get into exercise. I got to get my degree. I got to get in a relationship. Well, when I get a better job. No, this one is talking about accepting the moment exactly as it is. The first step in moving from enslavement to freedom is to accept the anguish and get in touch with what's happening. And the second step is absolute acceptance. Oh, the ego hates that. The ego thinks if I accept the moment and if I accept myself exactly as I am, then I'll never change. If I accept the world as it is in this moment, then I'm condemning us. But you and I both know it's exactly the opposite. It's our resistance to what is that keeps us stuck in the what is, and it's our acceptance that opens the way for change. It's our acceptance that allows us to journey beyond our current story and expand into a story of greater healing and into a story of greater joy. In the Seder ritual, we take a piece of matzah and we break it. One piece we put back on the table. We don't eat it. We keep that piece. The other piece is called the afikomen. Afikomen is a Greek word that means dessert. And it's turned into a child's game. A Seder ritual tends to go on for longer than children can pay attention. So we distract them by hiding the afikomen, and they've got to find it. And if they find it, they get a reward when they hand it in. But the truth of the matter is that this is not a children's game. We break it because this is the nature of our enslavement. Ultimately, our stuckness and our enslavement is a reflection that we're broken. And the brokenness is that we have lost sight of the very thing that we need to get us out of our stuckness. Oh, maybe it's courage, maybe it's awareness, maybe it's whatever it is. letting go of fear. So at the end of the meal, they come together to say that, okay, the journey starts, we're broken. The journey concludes out of our wholeness. Now, I also want to say, for those of you who have never tasted matzah, we have 2 pristine pieces of matzah at our table in the lobby, and we invite you to risk tasting matzah. If, in fact, the Last Supper happened during Passover week, which 3 of the Gospels maintain, this was the bread, which is still reflected, incidentally, in the Catholic Church, because the wafers in the Catholic Church are unleavened. Places don't usually use matzah, however, because if you hear 100 or so people crunching on matzah, it's a... So the question is, if we are moving from a place of stuckness, if we're moving from a place where we awaken to things are not as we'd like them to be, hey, the earth is crying, there's part of us that's crying. It's like, what is freedom? In the Seder ritual, the tradition is that when one drinks the wine, and there's a tradition of 4 cups of wine. Nowadays, for me to get through a Seder, it's 4 sips of wine. You're supposed to lean to the left. I remember my grandfather, they'd put pillows, he'd lean to the left as a sign of freedom. I never got that. Why does that mean you're free, you're leaning to the left? But that comes from a time when the basic Seder ritual was expanding under Roman occupation. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the 1st century after the Common Era, a free person looked like a Roman nobleman. And what did a Roman nobleman do? They ate on couches, laying on their left side, eating with their right hand. It's why left-handed people were so skinny. Now, it's interesting that we take a model of what it looks like to be free from an oppressor. This is part of our consciousness. Because we do this. We look out at those we see as kind of the enemy, but we really want to emulate them. So I don't lean to the left. But I'd like to share with you what I do, and I'd like to invite you to do it with me, because this is what I think freedom sounds like. I'm going to say a sentence, and then I'm going to invite you to repeat it. However, I'd like to invite you to repeat it only if you're willing to allow it to be true. Okay? The first sentence is, I am exactly where I want to be.
I am exactly where I want to be.
Think about that. What's free? Free is, I'm not wishing I was somewhere else. I'm not wishing, I am exactly where I want to be. Do it again. I am exactly where I want to be. I am with exactly the people I want to be with.
I am with exactly the people I want to be with.
Obviously. I mean, really, this is obvious. We're all here. We want. I am doing exactly what I want to be doing in this moment.
I am doing exactly what I want to be doing in this moment.
And here's the biggie. We're going to do this twice. Actually, you could do it more than twice. You could take it with you through the day and through the week and through the year. I am exactly who I want to be in this moment. Again, I am exactly who I want to be in this moment. Hallelujah. Thank you.